Pleasant evening. The birds are singing. Mr. Cat, the producer, is wandering around, and the sun's beginning to set. Should be set in about 2 hours. Now I'm interested in why there's never any significant change in this country. Because to a significant degree it has to do with the type of situation we find ourselves in. Now change is fundamental. Change in terms of adapting to changing circumstances. But we seem to be rooted in the spot. We seem not to be able to envisage, let alone organise for change. And to a significant degree this has occurred because people have lost the ability to think beyond the everyday. I'll give you an example. Most people who are active today are involved in issue-orientated politics. Whether it's the climate emergency, whether it's race, whether it's First Nations issues, sexuality, gender. And you'll find that most people's energy is taken up in these movements. And these movements can, as we see, be incorporated within a private investment for private profit framework. We're seeing this with the World Pride events in Sydney, where corporations obviously have jumped on the bandwagon to the chagrin of a minority of the participants and are using these events to maximise their exposure and ultimately maximise their profits. We see it in the First Nations debate. Now ultimately there will be a treaty or a number of treaties in this country. There is a referendum at the end of the year regarding a voice to Parliament, which I'll speak about later on in the year. There are many steps have been taken forward and many have been taken backwards in the last 4 decades as issue-orientated politics not only dominate activists' agenda, they also dominate the agenda of government and at the state, local and federal level. And so what we've seen is the incorporation of these issue-orientated campaigns into the current structural framework. Because ultimately, although they provide freedom to oppressed minorities or improve the situation of oppressed minorities, the fact is that the basic fundamentals are never challenged by issue-orientated campaigns. I'm not saying they're not useful. They're very useful in terms of minorities trying to flex their muscles and gain their share of sunshine. But in terms of breaking, both intellectually and ideologically and physically, the framework which incorporates each and every one of us in Australia, a framework which is based on a private investment for private profit agenda. It's almost as if this has been incorporated into our national DNA. And various things have occurred over the last 4 years, various government policies which have pushed people in this direction. The concept of public has been so devalued and trashed that most people think that a public asset or a public service is somehow not as good as the private sector. And we see over and over and over again the private sector gorging itself on taxpayers' money and making a hash of many government initiatives which should be in the hands of the public sector, not the private sector. Aged care, early childhood development, NDIS, NBN are just a few I can outline. So I was very interested when we began public interest before corporate interest, that most people had no idea what the term public meant. Because not only is the public idea of a public good being devalued, the concept of a public intellectual has now been expunged from society. Because unlike 40 years ago, when many people in higher education who worked in higher education had tenure and protection from losing their job and not being employed anywhere else, we now find that many educational facilities, if not most, rely on short-term contracts, and you use these short-term contracts to destroy the ability of academics and intellectuals to publicly articulate positions. So what happens is, what we see is that those people who have access to social media, who have nothing to say except things to divide us, who have nothing to do but spread misinformation and disinformation, get a free run. Because nobody in the public space is willing to stand up and expose their activities. And we see this over and over again. It was very prevalent when, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw misinformation and disinformation become a day-to-day feature of everyday existence in this country. So while we accept there should be inequalities in power and wealth in society, we will continue to not look at the basic infrastructure, because what's happened over the last 40 years is very interesting, and I speak about it consistently on these YouTube presentation, radio programs, Things I Write. And it's very simple. The 19th century and the early 20th century was based on the principle of people forcing the state to look after the public sphere, to look after the public interest through strikes and revolts and revolutions, reform movements. Movements which were based on the idea of sharing power and holding wealth in common. Today, in the 21st century, what we have are movements which are based on promoting sectional interests, but not actually looking at the fundamental problems. So we see in the First Nations struggle the evolution of a middle class which identifies with the middle class in this country. We see people talk about the pink dollar, the black dollar, the green dollar, as if every social movement has some type of monetary value. We don't see people in most people involved in issue-orientated campaigns talk about those fundamental inequalities. It's all very well to have a treaty. It's all very well to be recognised for your sexual orientation or have your position on gender recognised. It's all very well to bring up the cause of the climate emergency. But the problem is that if we conduct these campaigns within their parameters, the parameter of private investment for private profit, the parameter of extending the private sector, the parameter of increasing the centralisation of power in unaccountable corporations who are only accountable to their major shareholders, who consistently have a significant impact on the legislative agenda. Now, I know you're sick of this, but we are a very rich country. We have a minuscule population. We have an educated population. We have a population whose healthcare needs and pharmaceutical needs are partially met by an underfunded public sector. We have a population that could, as we saw at the beginning of the late 19th century and the early 20th century in Australia, we have a population which could set the trends universally regarding what is important and what isn't important. But there is no movement apart from some old-fashioned, fossilised socialist and Marxist groups who can continue to put forward the same discredited analysis. There is no movement outside issue-orientated politics in this country which challenges the basic assumptions this country is based on. And that's why we have seen so much taken away. And so the question isn't what issue-orientated campaign we should be involved in. The question is, although we are involved in issue-orientated campaigns, we should try to direct that issue-orientated campaign to actually improve the lot of everybody in that particular section of society. There's no point having women on corporate boards if corporate boards continue to function in the way they do, to create maximum profits irrespective of the harm they do to society, irrespective of how they exploit their consumers, irrespective of how they exploit their workers. There's no point. There's no point being involved in gender politics if the life of most people does not change. It's all very well to get a new layer, a minuscule layer, enjoying the profits of that particular campaign. But those struggles should incorporate everybody, should try to extend the decision-making capacity of people, should try to ensure the commonwealth is used for the common good, not used to maximise the profits of a minority. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whose foot is on your neck. It can be a yellow foot, a white foot, a black foot, a gay foot, a fascist foot. Ultimately, it's the fact that somebody has their foot on your neck which is the problem. And that's what we have forgotten. Changing life for a minority who become incorporated into the same system which exploits the majority of people changes nothing. Putting more women on the Reserve Bank Board, putting people from the third gender on the Reserve Bank Board, putting people born overseas on the Reserve Bank Board, putting people of colour on the Reserve Bank Board does not change the fact does not change what the Reserve Bank does. And the same for corporations, bureaucracies, governments. So ultimately, although I'm not discouraging you from being involved in issue-orientated campaigns, I'm asking you to look at the parameters that contain that campaign. I'm asking you to extend that campaign beyond that issue and to ensure that everybody benefits, not just a new bureaucracy or a new minority which apes the ruling classes. And until we are willing to do this, issues will come and go, but the increasing gaps which are appearing in the society, the fracture lines which are appearing, fracture lines which are not based on race or where you were born or your gender or your sexual orientation or the language you speak, but fracture lines which are based on power and the accumulation of wealth at the expense of the population. Have you ever thought, why do we need private charities in this rich country? Why do we have 1/3 of the population living on social security benefits which are below or near the poverty line? Why do we have so many psychological issues? So many people who are unhappy with the situation they find themselves in. Why do we find ourselves having people sleeping rough in parks and on the streets? Why are rents so high? Why are real estate values so high? Why are 90% of the population every day trying in one way or another to meet their financial commitments and not having very little at the end of the week, irrespective of what type of work they do? And until we address these questions, we can solve issue after issue after issue, not to the satisfaction of everybody, but to the satisfaction of a majority involved in those campaigns. But we will not be able to resolve the fundamental questions which make us a society that has not reached and will never reach its full potential, will never benefit its citizens, will never increase the public space, will never provide the necessities or access to the necessities, will never be in a position to provide a universal basic income to each and every person living on this continent. We'll continue to be badgered by private charities. We'll continue to see the same news items on social media and television, hear the same stories on radio week after week, year after year, decade after decade. Nothing changes unless there are fundamental shifts in the way we behave and act and the structures that we create. Now, on the 15th of March, I'll be doing a presentation on the 1871 Paris Commune at the Footscray Hotel in Melbourne, 44 Hopkins Street, Footscray, starting around 6:30 p.m. The presentation will start at 7. Bring food if you want to eat something. Drinks are available at very reasonable bar prices. I will be videotaping the presentation because I think we need to look at the past. We need to look at what happened in the past, how people broke through the consequences of their actions. Although it was 1871, the Paris Commune was the world's first workers' government. It was anti-militarist, feminist, egalitarian, radical democratic, and they paid a huge price for challenging the status quo. We don't need to pay that price. We can challenge the status quo, and we need to challenge the status quo, not just on issues, but looking at the fundamental inequalities and the structures which maintain and exploit these inequalities.